A chamber girl was a female domestic servant in medieval households, most commonly employed in the homes of nobles, wealthy merchants, or members of the clergy. Her primary role was to attend to the private rooms or chambers of the lady of the house, which is where her title originated. Unlike general servants who worked in kitchens, stables, or fields, a chamber girl's duties were more personal and intimate, requiring her to be trustworthy, discreet, and attentive. She assisted with cleaning sleeping quarters, maintaining linens, and helping her mistress with daily personal needs such as dressing, grooming, and preparing for social occasions. Because she worked so closely with noble women, the chamber girl often observed aspects of aristocratic life that were hidden from the rest of the household. Despite this proximity, she remained firmly within the servant class, with little power or independence. Most chamber girls came from peasant or lower-class families and entered service at a young age, often in their early teens. For many families, sending a daughter to work as a chamber girl was a way to reduce financial burden while giving the girl a chance to earn food, shelter, and sometimes wages. The role required endurance, humility, and obedience, as mistakes could result in punishment or dismissal. Chamber girls were expected to be modest, respectful, and loyal, as their work placed them in close contact with valuable belongings and private family matters. While the position offered little freedom, it was sometimes viewed as a respectable form of employment for young women, especially compared to harsher labor such as farm work. In essence, the chamber girl was a quiet but essential presence in medieval households, maintaining comfort and order behind the scenes while sacrificing personal comfort and autonomy. The life of a chamber girl unfolded within the rigid social structure of medieval Europe, a period that roughly spanned from the 5th to the late 15th century. This era was defined by feudalism, a system in which land ownership determined power and social rank. Society was divided into clear classes: the nobility, the clergy, and the peasantry, with very little movement between them. Most chamber girls came from the lowest levels of this hierarchy and entered service in noble households that functioned almost like small communities. Castles, manors, and large townhouses were busy environments, filled with servants, each assigned specific tasks to support the comfort and status of the ruling family. Daily life was shaped by religious beliefs, seasonal cycles, and constant concerns about disease, war, and food shortages. The Catholic Church played a dominant role in shaping moral expectations, especially for women, emphasizing obedience, chastity, and humility. For a chamber girl, this meant strict rules governing behavior, speech, and appearance. Medieval Europe lacked modern sanitation, making cleanliness difficult, yet ironically essential in noble chambers where comfort and prestige mattered greatly. Lighting came from candles, water had to be carried by hand, and heating relied on fireplaces, all of which added to the labor-intensive nature of domestic service. Education was rare for lower-class women, so chamber girls often learned their duties through observation rather than formal instruction. The social setting offered little privacy or personal freedom, as servants were constantly under supervision. Life expectancy was low, and illness was common, making survival itself an achievement. Within this environment, the chamber girl's life reflected the broader struggles of medieval society: hard work, strict hierarchy, and limited opportunity, while also revealing the unseen labor that sustained elite lifestyles. Within the household hierarchy of a medieval noble home, the chamber girl occupied a low but specialized position. She ranked above general laborers such as scullery maids or stable hands, yet remained far below stewards, ladies-in-waiting, or high-ranking servants. Her role was defined not by authority, but by service, particularly personal service to the lady of the house. Because of this closeness, chamber girls were expected to display impeccable behavior and unwavering loyalty. Trust was essential, as they handled expensive fabrics, jewelry, and personal items, and were privy to private conversations and routines. Despite this trust, they held little power and could be dismissed easily if they displeased their employers. Orders flowed downward in strict lines, and questioning instructions was rarely tolerated. A chamber girl answered not only to her mistress, but also to senior servants who supervised domestic operations. Her workday was shaped entirely by the needs of others, leaving her with almost no control over her time. Although her position offered slightly better living conditions than outdoor labor, it also came with emotional strain, as she constantly navigated the fine line between familiarity and subservience. She was close enough to observe wealth and luxury, but forbidden from enjoying it herself. Advancement within the household was possible but rare, and depended on years of loyal service, good behavior, and sometimes luck. Some chamber girls might eventually become senior attendants or marry skilled workers within the household, slightly improving their status. Nevertheless, the hierarchy ensured that her identity remained tied to service. Her position symbolized the rigid social order of medieval life, where one's role was predetermined by birth and reinforced daily through labor, obedience, and dependence.
Most chamber girls in medieval Europe were born into peasant or lower-class families, where life was defined by hardship, physical labor, and economic uncertainty. Their families typically lived in small villages or rural areas, surviving through farming, manual trades, or day labor. Peasant households depended heavily on every family member contributing to survival, including children, who were expected to work from a young age. Food shortages, poor harvests, disease, and heavy taxes imposed by landowners often left families struggling to meet basic needs. In such conditions, daughters were frequently seen as both a responsibility and a potential resource. Sending a girl into domestic service reduced the number of mouths to feed at home, while offering her access to food, clothing, and shelter elsewhere. Unlike sons, who were more often needed for agricultural labor, daughters could be spared more easily and placed into service. These families rarely had wealth, land ownership, or social influence, which meant their children had very limited opportunities for advancement. Education was almost non-existent for peasant girls, as literacy was considered unnecessary for their expected roles as wives, servants, or laborers. From an early age, girls learned skills such as cleaning, sewing, cooking, and caring for others, all of which prepared them for domestic service. A chamber girl's background shaped her expectations in life. Obedience, endurance, and humility were values taught within the family. For many, becoming a chamber girl was not a choice driven by ambition, but a practical decision rooted in survival. The lower-class origins of chamber girls reinforced the rigid social boundaries of medieval society, where birth largely determined one's future, and service was one of the few paths open to poor young women. Girls became chamber girls through a combination of necessity, opportunity, and social custom, rather than personal choice. In medieval society, employment options for young women were extremely limited, especially for those without dowries, land, or family connections. Domestic service was one of the few respectable forms of work available to lower-class girls. Families often arranged service placements through local networks, manor officials, or recommendations from other servants. Sometimes a girl was sent to serve in the household of a local lord or wealthy family known to her village, while in other cases she was sent farther away to reduce the risk of scandal or temptation. The primary reason girls entered service was economic survival. In exchange for their labor, chamber girls received food, clothing, and a place to sleep, which could significantly ease the burden on their families. Some households also paid small wages, which might be saved for future marriage or sent back home. Parents believed service could teach their daughters discipline, moral behavior, and domestic skills valued in marriage. For the girl herself, becoming a chamber girl offered a chance to escape the harshest forms of rural labor, such as working in the fields, though it replaced them with long hours indoors. Service also exposed girls to refined manners, noble customs, and household management, skills that could slightly improve their prospects later in life. However, this path was not without risk. Girls were vulnerable to mistreatment, exploitation, or sudden dismissal, and they had little legal protection. Despite these dangers, domestic service remained a common and socially accepted route for lower-class girls, making the role of chamber girl both a necessity and a reflection of the limited choices available to women in medieval Europe. Girls entered chamber service at a very young age, often between the ages of 10 and 14, though some began even earlier, depending on family circumstances. Childhood in medieval Europe was short, especially for the poor, and children were expected to take on adult responsibilities as soon as they were physically able. By the time a girl reached her early teens, she was considered capable of full-time work. Families often sent daughters into service shortly after childhood, believing early exposure to discipline and labor would shape proper behavior. Younger girls usually began with simpler tasks, such as cleaning, fetching water, or assisting older servants, gradually learning more complex responsibilities. Starting service early also allowed households to mold girls into obedient workers who understood the rules and expectations of noble life. For the girls themselves, this transition could be emotionally challenging, as it often meant leaving home, family, and familiar surroundings for the first time. Once in service, their lives followed a strict routine with little personal freedom, and childhood comforts were quickly replaced by responsibility. Early entry into service also reduced opportunities for education or leisure, reinforcing a life centered on labor. Some girls remained in service for many years, moving between households or advancing slightly within the same one. Others left service in their late teens or early 20s to marry, often using any saved wages or connections gained through service. Beginning work at such a young age shaped a chamber girl's identity, teaching her endurance, obedience, and self-restraint. This early start highlights how medieval society viewed childhood not as a protected stage of life, but as preparation for adult roles defined by class, gender, and necessity. A chamber girl's sleeping arrangements in medieval Europe reflected her low social status and the practical nature of her role. Unlike the noble family she served, who slept in private chambers with heavy beds, curtains, and warmth, the chamber girl was usually given a small, uncomfortable sleeping space. In many households, she slept on a straw mattress or simple pallet laid directly on the floor. These sleeping areas were often located in shared servant quarters, storage rooms, hallways, or even within the chamber she was responsible for maintaining, especially if her duties required her to be nearby at night. Privacy was rare, and chamber girls commonly shared sleeping spaces with other female servants. The rooms were poorly heated and dimly lit, making cold nights particularly harsh during winter months. Blankets were thin and worn, offering little protection against the cold. Despite these commissions, chamber girls were expected to rise early and be ready to work immediately upon waking. The lack of rest often contributed to physical exhaustion, especially given the long hours of labor required each day. Sleeping close to their workplace meant that chamber girls were on call at almost any hour, should their mistress require assistance during the night. This arrangement blurred the line between work and rest, reinforcing the idea that the chamber girl's time was never truly her own. Her sleeping place was not meant to offer comfort, but merely function as a space for recovery before the next day's labor. The modest and temporary nature of her sleeping quarters symbolized her role within the household, present when needed, invisible when not, and always subordinate to the comfort of those she served.
A chamber girl in medieval times owned very little, as personal possessions were considered unnecessary for servants and often beyond their means. Most of what she used on a daily basis was provided by the household, leaving her with only a few items she could truly call her own. These personal belongings typically included a simple change of clothing, perhaps a spare linen shift, and small items such as a comb, a needle, or a piece of thread. Any possessions she brought from home were likely handmade or inherited, carrying more emotional value than material worth. Storage space was extremely limited, so belongings were often kept in a small chest, sack, or bundle tucked away near her sleeping area. Chamber girls were discouraged from accumulating property, as it could be seen as a sign of distraction or disloyalty. Wages, if paid, were modest and often saved rather than spent, sometimes sent back to family or reserved for future marriage. Items such as shoes, cloaks, or tools were valuable and carefully maintained, as replacing them was difficult. Jewelry, books, or decorative objects were almost unheard of for a servant of her rank. The lack of personal belongings reinforced the idea that a chamber girl's identity was tied to her service rather than her individuality. Her possessions were functional, not expressive, chosen for durability rather than comfort or beauty. This minimal ownership also reflected the broader economic reality of medieval peasants, where survival took precedence over personal expression. In a life defined by labor and obedience, owning little was both a necessity and a reminder of her place in society. Food and clothing provided to a chamber girl by the household were essential parts of her compensation, as wages alone were often insufficient to sustain her. Meals were simple, filling, and designed to provide enough energy for long hours of physical labor. A typical diet included bread, porridge, vegetables, and occasionally cheese or broth, with meat being rare and usually reserved for feast days or leftovers from the noble table. While the food was better and more consistent than what many peasants received at home, it was still far from luxurious. Servants ate separately from the family, often in a common hall or kitchen, and had little choice in what they were given. Clothing was also supplied by the household and was practical rather than comfortable or fashionable. A chamber girl usually wore a plain woolen dress, an apron, and a linen shift, along with a head covering that signified modesty and servitude. These garments were durable and designed for daily labor, not warmth or personal style. Clothing was issued sparingly and replacements were infrequent, so garments were often patched and reused until they wore out completely. Shoes were particularly valuable and sometimes shared or repaired repeatedly. While the provided food and clothing ensured basic survival, they also served as visible markers of status, clearly distinguishing servants from the nobility. Through these provisions, the household maintained control over the chamber girl's appearance and well-being, reinforcing dependence while meeting the minimum needs required for service. Cleaning chambers was one of the most important and time-consuming responsibilities of a medieval chamber girl. The chambers, particularly belonging to noble women, were expected to remain orderly and presentable at all times, as they reflected the wealth and status of the household. Each morning, the chamber girl began her day by sweeping the floors, which were often made of stone or wood and covered with rushes or simple rugs. Dust, dirt, and debris accumulated quickly, especially in large castles where people, animals, and supplies constantly moved in and out. She cleaned furniture, benches, chests, and window ledges using cloths and water, as cleaning tools were very basic. Bedding was shaken out to remove insects and lice, a necessary task in a time when fleas and lice were common. The chamber girl also aired the room by opening shutters when weather allowed, helping reduce odors caused by poor ventilation and the absence of modern sanitation. Spills, stains, and mud tracked in from outside had to be dealt with immediately to avoid punishment or criticism. Cleaning was not a quick task but a careful routine that required attention to detail, as even small oversights could be noticed by the lady of the house. This work demanded physical endurance, as bending, lifting, and scrubbing were done by hand. Although the labor was repetitive and exhausting, it played a vital role in maintaining comfort and hygiene in an era where illness spread easily. Through her cleaning, the chamber girl helped create a sense of order and refinement that masked the harsher realities of medieval life. Making beds and maintaining linens was another essential duty that required both physical effort and careful handling. Noble beds were large, heavy structures layered with straw mattresses, feather beds, sheets, blankets, and decorative coverings. Each morning, the chamber girl removed and shook out the bedding to remove dirt and pests, then carefully remade the bed to appear neat and inviting. Linens were valuable possessions, often made from fine materials and required careful care to prevent damage. Washing linens was a demanding process, involving boiling water, harsh soaps, and long hours of scrubbing, often performed outdoors or in service areas. After washing, linens had to be dried, folded, and stored properly to avoid mildew or pests. The chamber girl was responsible for mending torn sheets and worn pillowcases, using basic sewing skills to extend their usefulness. She also rotated linens to ensure even wear, as replacements were expensive and rare. Clean, well-maintained linens were a sign of respectable household, and failure to care for them properly could bring harsh consequences. This task required patience, precision, and constant vigilance, as linens were easily soiled and quickly deteriorated. Through this unseen labor, the chamber girl preserved both the comfort of her mistress and the household's reputation. Carrying water and emptying chamber pots were among the most physically demanding and unpleasant duties assigned to a chamber girl. In medieval households, water had to be fetched by hand from wells, rivers, or cisterns, often located far from the living quarters. The chamber girl carried heavy buckets multiple times a day to supply water for washing, cleaning, and basic hygiene. This task required strength and balance, especially when climbing stairs or navigating narrow corridors. Emptying chamber pots was equally necessary, as there were no indoor toilets. Chamber pots were used during the night and needed to be emptied early in the morning to prevent odors and disease. The contents were usually dumped into designated waste areas, latrines, or outside pits, sometimes far from the main building. This work exposed chamber girls to foul smells and health risks, yet it was considered an unavoidable part of service. There was little recognition for this labor, despite its importance in maintaining basic sanitation. The repetition of these tasks throughout the day added to physical exhaustion and reinforced the low status of the role. Yet, without this effort, noble households could not function smoothly. Lighting fires and candles was a daily responsibility that required skill, caution, and constant attention. Fire was essential for warmth, light, and comfort, especially in stone buildings that were cold and dark for much of the year. The chamber girl was responsible for ensuring that fires were lit at the right times, using flint, tinder, and carefully preserved embers. She cleaned out ashes, arranged firewood, and maintained the flame throughout the day. Candles and oil lamps were also tended, particularly in private chambers during evening hours. These sources of light were expensive, so chamber girls had to use them sparingly and extinguish them when no longer needed. Fire posed a serious danger, as accidental blazes could destroy entire buildings. For this reason, mistakes were punished severely. Despite the risks, this duty was vital to the comfort of the household. By managing fire and light, the chamber girl helped transform cold, dark rooms into livable spaces, though her efforts remained largely unnoticed. Assisting with dressing and grooming was one of the most personal and sensitive duties of a medieval chamber girl, requiring trust, discretion, and careful attention to detail. Noble clothing was complex, layered, and time-consuming to put on, making assistance essential. A chamber girl helped her mistress dress each morning by laying out garments in the correct order, fastening laces, tying belts, and adjusting sleeves and bodices. Many dresses were heavy and restrictive, made from thick fabrics such as wool, velvet, or brocade, and often required another person to secure them properly. Grooming was equally important, as a noble woman's appearance reflected not only her own status, but also the reputation of her household. The chamber girl assisted with washing the face and hands, trimming nails, and ensuring that her mistress appeared clean and composed. In an age without modern cosmetics or hygiene products, grooming relied on simple tools such as cloths, scented water, herbal mixtures, and basic ointments. The chamber girl needed to be gentle and attentive, anticipating her mistress's preferences while remaining silent and respectful. Any mistake, such as pulling too tightly on a lace or misplacing a garment, could result in scolding or punishment. Despite the intimacy of this role, the chamber girl was expected to remain invisible, never commenting on her mistress's body or appearance unless asked. This daily routine reinforced social boundaries, reminding both women of their unequal positions. Through assisting with dressing and grooming, the chamber girl played a key role in maintaining the outward image of nobility, even though she herself remained excluded from the comfort and elegance she helped create.
Helping with bathing and hair care was another demanding and intimate responsibility that fell to the chamber girl, especially given the limited hygiene practices of medieval Europe. Bathing was not a daily activity, but when it occurred, it required significant preparation. The chamber girl gathered water, often heated over a fire, and carried it in heavy vessels to the bathing area, which might be a wooden tub placed in a private chamber. She helped undress her mistress, ensured privacy, and assisted in washing using cloths, sponges, and scented or herbal-infused water. Soap was rare and expensive, so cleansing relied on simple methods that still required careful attention. Hair care was a particularly important aspect of noble appearance, as long, well-kept hair was seen as a symbol of beauty and status. The chamber girls spent hours combing, detangling, and braiding hair, often using oils or herbal treatments to keep it manageable and clean. She was responsible for removing lice or dirt, a task that required patience and discretion. Hairstyles varied depending on fashion, marital status, and occasion, and the chamber girl had to be familiar with these customs. Any discomfort experienced by her mistress could lead to blame, even if the cause was unavoidable. This role demanded physical closeness while maintaining emotional distance, reinforcing strict boundaries of respect and obedience. Helping with bathing and hair care placed the chamber girl in moments of vulnerability with her mistress, yet these moments never altered the power imbalance between them. Instead, they highlighted the trust placed in servants while underscoring their lack of authority. Preparing clothing and jewelry was a task that combined organization, care, and constant vigilance, as these items were among the most valuable possessions in a noble household. A chamber girl was responsible for selecting appropriate garments for different occasions, ensuring they were clean, mended, and ready to wear. This required an understanding of social customs, as clothing choices reflected rank, modesty, and formality. She brushed fabrics, removed dust, repaired tears, and carefully folded or hung garments to prevent damage. Jewelry, including rings, necklaces, brooches, and hair ornaments, was handled with extreme caution. These items were often made from precious metals and gemstones, making them targets for theft and symbols of wealth. The chamber girl prepared jewelry by cleaning it, arranging it for easy access, and returning it securely to chests or boxes after use. Any loss or damage could result in severe punishment, regardless of fault. This responsibility required absolute honesty, as servants were frequently suspected of wrongdoing. Preparing clothing and jewelry also meant assisting with seasonal changes, rotating heavier garments in winter and lighter ones in summer. Through this work, the chamber girl contributed to the visual display of power and refinement that defined noble life. Although she handled luxury daily, she was forbidden from enjoying it herself, reinforcing the strict divide between servant and mistress. Her careful preparation ensured that nobility appeared flawless, while her own labor remained unseen and unacknowledged. Long working hours were a defining feature of a chamber girl's life in medieval Europe, leaving her with little rest or personal time. Her day often began before sunrise, as she was expected to prepare chambers, light fires, and assist her mistress with morning routines. There was no fixed schedule or regulated workday. Instead, her hours were determined entirely by the needs of the household. From early morning until late at night, the chamber girl remained on constant duty, performing physical tasks, running errands, and standing by in case she was needed. Even when her mistress retired for the evening, the chamber girl's responsibilities did not always end. She might be required to remain nearby in case of illness, discomfort, or unexpected demands during the night. This constant availability meant that true rest was rare. Meals were eaten quickly and often interrupted, and breaks were not guaranteed. The lack of personal time reinforced her subordinate status, as her labor was viewed as an obligation rather than an exchange. Religious observances and feast days offered little relief, as preparation and cleanup often increased the workload instead of reducing it. The expectation of obedience meant that refusal or complaint was unacceptable, regardless of exhaustion.
Over time, these relentless hours shaped her identity, teaching her to suppress fatigue and prioritize others' comfort above her own. The absence of labor laws or protections meant that her employer had complete control over her time. Long working hours were not just a condition of employment, but a reflection of medieval society's belief that servants existed solely to serve. This unending cycle of work left chamber girls physically drained and emotionally resigned, reinforcing the rigid hierarchy that defined their lives.
A chamber girl's workload varied significantly with the seasons, reflecting the close connection between medieval life and the natural world. During winter, the cold intensified her responsibilities, as fires needed constant tending to keep chambers warm. Heavy clothing and bedding had to be cleaned, repaired, and rotated, adding to the physical strain. Shorter daylight hours required more candle lighting, increasing the risk and responsibility associated with fire management. Winter also brought illness, making the chamber girl's role more demanding as she cared for sick household members. In contrast, summer presented a different set of challenges. Warmer weather increased the need for cleaning, airing rooms, and managing unpleasant odors caused by heat and poor sanitation. Insects were more common, requiring frequent cleaning of bedding and chambers. Summer was also a time of increased travel and social activity among the nobility, which meant more guests, more laundry, and more preparation for events. Spring and autumn were transitional seasons, marked by deep cleaning, repairs, and preparation for upcoming weather changes. Linens were washed and stored, clothing adjusted, and chambers reorganized. These seasonal shifts meant that the chamber girl's labor was never consistent or predictable. Each season brought its own demands, requiring adaptability and endurance. While noble families enjoyed seasonal comforts and celebrations, the chamber girl experienced these changes primarily as fluctuations in workload. The rhythm of the year was felt not through leisure or festivity, but through changing labor expectations that kept her perpetually busy. Physical exhaustion and health problems were common and often unavoidable aspects of a chamber girl's life. The constant bending, lifting, scrubbing, and carrying of heavy objects placed severe strain on her body, particularly her back, arms, and legs. Repetitive tasks performed daily without rest led to chronic pain and fatigue. Poor sleeping conditions and long working hours prevented proper recovery, leaving her body in a near constant state of weariness. Exposure to cold, damp environments increased the risk of respiratory illnesses, while poor sanitation made infections common. Chamber girls frequently handled dirty linens, waste, and stagnant water, all of which posed serious health risks. Cuts, burns, and bruises were frequent, especially when managing fires or carrying heavy loads, yet medical care was limited and often unavailable to servants. Illness rarely excused a chamber girl from her duties. Unless she was severely incapacitated, she was expected to continue working. Even then, she risked dismissal if she could no longer perform her tasks. Malnutrition also contributed to poor health, as servant diets, though regular, lacked variety and nutrients. Over time, the physical toll of service shortened life expectancy and reduced quality of life. Many chamber girls aged quickly, their youth consumed by labor. Their suffering was largely invisible, as medieval society viewed such hardship as natural and unavoidable for those of low status. Physical exhaustion was not seen as a problem to be solved, but as proof of obedience and usefulness.
Through this constant strain, the chamber girl's body became another tool of service, worn down in silence to sustain the comfort of others. Obedience and strict behavior standards governed nearly every aspect of a chamber girl's life in medieval households. From the moment she entered service, she was expected to submit completely to the authority of her superiors, including her mistress, senior servants, and the head of the household. Obedience was not simply encouraged but demanded, as it was believed to reflect moral character and social order. Chamber girls were required to follow instructions without hesitation or question, even when tasks were exhausting or unreasonable. Proper behavior included speaking only when spoken to, maintaining a respectful posture, and avoiding eye contact unless permitted. Silence was often considered a virtue, particularly during moments of personal service, where discretion and restraint were essential. Any display of emotion, disagreement, or fatigue could be interpreted as disrespect or laziness. Cleanliness, modest dress, and careful manners were enforced, as a servant's appearance reflected on the household's reputation. Religious expectations further shaped behavior, emphasizing humility, chastity, and obedience as godly virtues. A chamber girl's actions were constantly observed, leaving little room for personal expression or individuality. Even outside her immediate duties, she was expected to behave appropriately, avoiding gossip, flirtation, or familiarity with others. These standards were designed not only to ensure smooth household functioning, but also to reinforce social hierarchy. By demanding strict obedience, medieval households maintained control and reminded chamber girls of their place within society. Compliance became a survival skill, as those who adapted to these expectations were more likely to retain their positions. Over time, constant discipline shaped the chamber girl's identity, teaching her to internalize obedience as both duty and necessity.
Punishments for mistakes were a constant threat in the life of a chamber girl and served as a powerful tool for maintaining discipline. Errors such as breaking an object, damaging clothing, failing to complete tasks properly, or displeasing a mistress could result in immediate consequences. The severity of punishment varied depending on the household, the social status of the employer, and the nature of the mistake. Minor offenses often led to verbal reprimands, humiliation, or additional work, while more serious errors could result in reduced food, withheld wages, or dismissal. In some cases, physical punishment such as slaps or beatings was used, particularly in households where servants were viewed as property rather than individuals. Dismissal was one of the most feared punishments, as it left a chamber girl without shelter, food, or protection and damaged her reputation, making it difficult to find new employment. Punishments were often administered publicly to serve as warnings to other servants. There was little opportunity for defense, as servants had no formal rights, and their word held little weight against that of their employers. Fear of punishment encouraged constant vigilance, forcing chamber girls to work carefully despite exhaustion. This environment created stress and anxiety, as even minor accidents could have serious consequences. Punishment was not always fair or proportionate, and servants could be blamed for issues beyond their control. These practices reflected a broader medieval belief that strict discipline was necessary to maintain order. For chamber girls, punishment reinforced obedience through fear, shaping their behavior and reinforcing the unequal power dynamic within the household. Loyalty and discretion were among the most valued qualities expected of a chamber girl, particularly because of her close access to the private life of her mistress. Chamber girls witnessed intimate moments, overheard conversations, and handled personal belongings, making trust essential. Any breach of loyalty, whether real or suspected, could lead to severe punishment or dismissal. Discretion meant keeping silent about household matters, including family conflicts, financial concerns, or personal habits. Gossip was strictly forbidden, as it could damage reputations and threaten social standing. A chamber girl was expected to protect her mistress's privacy even when treated harshly or unfairly. Loyalty also meant prioritizing the household's interests above her own, showing dedication regardless of personal cost. This expectation extended beyond work duties, shaping how she spoke, behaved, and interacted with others. Demonstrating loyalty could sometimes bring small rewards, such as favors, gifts, or continued employment. However, loyalty was often one-sided, as employers were not obligated to show the same commitment in return. Discretion also protected the chamber girl herself, as speaking out could lead to accusations of dishonesty or rebellion. In a society where reputation mattered greatly, silence became a form of survival. By remaining loyal and discreet, chamber girls ensured stability within the household and preserved social order. These qualities reinforced the idea that servants were extensions of their employers, existing to support and protect noble status. Through unwavering loyalty and silence, the chamber girl upheld the structure of medieval society, even as her own voice remained unheard. Chamber girls were generally viewed through the lens of their social class, which strongly influenced how others perceived and treated them in medieval society. Despite their close proximity to noblewomen and private household spaces, chamber girls were still regarded as low-status servants, often invisible except when they made mistakes. To the nobility, they were useful but replaceable, valued primarily for their labor rather than as individuals. Their presence was expected to be quiet and unobtrusive, and excessive familiarity was discouraged. Among townspeople and villagers, chamber girls occupied an ambiguous position. On one hand, working in a noble household could bring a small degree of respect, as it suggested trustworthiness and exposure to refined customs. On the other hand, their servant status placed them firmly below free laborers or skilled workers. Chamber girls were sometimes viewed with suspicion or envy, especially if they appeared to benefit from better food or clothing than peasants. Moral judgment was also common, as young women in service were often closely scrutinized for their behavior, modesty, and reputation. Any rumor or perceived misconduct could quickly damage a chamber girl's standing and future prospects. Religious teachings reinforced the idea that servants should be humble and obedient, further shaping how society viewed them. Overall, chamber girls were seen not as independent people, but as extensions of the households they served. Their identity was tied to their role, making their personal experiences largely invisible to the wider world.
Interactions with other servants formed a significant part of a chamber girl's social world, as these relationships were often her only source of companionship and understanding. In large households, servants were organized into a strict hierarchy, and chamber girls had to navigate this structure carefully. They typically worked closely with other female servants, such as maids, laundresses, and kitchen workers, sharing duties and occasionally living quarters. These relationships could offer moments of solidarity, shared humor, and mutual support in an otherwise demanding environment. However, competition and tension were also common, as favor from the mistress or advancement within the household was limited. Senior servants often held authority over chamber girls and could assign tasks or report mistakes, reinforcing power imbalances, even among servants. Gossip circulated easily in servant quarters, making trust fragile. A careless word could lead to punishment or damaged reputation. Despite these risks, friendships sometimes formed, providing emotional relief and a sense of belonging. Servants shared knowledge, warned each other of strict masters, and passed down skills necessary for survival in service. Male servants were generally interacted with cautiously, as improper behavior could lead to severe consequences for the chamber girl. These interactions were shaped by constant awareness of social rules and personal safety. Within the servant community, chamber girls experienced both cooperation and conflict, reflecting the broader inequalities and pressures of medieval household life. Despite their close physical presence to noblewomen, chamber girls remained socially distant from the nobility they served. This separation was strictly enforced through behavior, language, and daily routines. A chamber girl could spend hours assisting her mistress with dressing, grooming, and private tasks, yet she was never considered an equal or companion. She addressed her mistress with formal titles and followed strict rules regarding speech and posture. Any sign of familiarity beyond her role could be interpreted as disrespect. Meals were eaten separately, living spaces were divided, and social interactions were limited to service-related communication. This distance was maintained to preserve social order and reinforce class distinctions. Even when a chamber girl earned trust or affection, her status did not change. She could be dismissed at any time, regardless of years of loyal service. The intimacy of her duties did not grant her influence or protection. Observing wealth, comfort, and privilege daily often heightened awareness of her own limitations. The distance between servant and noble was both physical and emotional, carefully maintained to prevent any challenge to hierarchy. This contrast, being close enough to serve, yet too distant to belong, defined the chamber girl's experience. It highlighted the rigid class boundaries of medieval society, where proximity to power did not equate to access to it. Through this enforced distance, the household preserved noble authority while relying on the invisible labor of chamber girls to sustain it. The risk of illness and injury was a constant and unavoidable reality in the life of a medieval chamber girl. The nature of her work exposed her daily to unsanitary conditions, physical strain, and environmental dangers. Cleaning chambers, handling dirty linens, emptying chamber pots, and carrying water all brought her into close contact with waste and bacteria at a time when the causes of disease were poorly understood. Without knowledge of germs or proper sanitation, infections spread easily, and even minor wounds could become serious or fatal. Cold, damp living conditions weakened the body, particularly during winter months, increasing the likelihood of respiratory illnesses, such as coughs, fevers, and pneumonia. Repetitive physical labor caused chronic pain in the back, shoulders, and joints, while lifting heavy buckets or bedding often resulted in strains or injuries. Burns were a common hazard due to constant interaction with fires, hot water, and candles. Slips and falls on stone floors or narrow staircases posed additional risks, especially when carrying heavy loads. Medical care was limited and largely inaccessible to servants, who relied on home remedies or herbal treatments if available at all. Illness rarely excused a chamber girl from her duties unless she was completely incapacitated. Working through sickness was common, often worsening conditions and spreading disease throughout the household. These health risks shortened life expectancy and reduced quality of life, yet they were considered normal for people of her status. Society viewed such suffering as an expected consequence of poverty and labor. The physical vulnerability of chamber girls was a silent cost of maintaining noble comfort, borne without recognition or relief.
Harsh treatment and abuse were real dangers faced by chamber girls, stemming from their powerless position within the household hierarchy. Employers held near total authority over their servants, and discipline was often enforced through fear rather than fairness. Verbal abuse, including insults, shouting, and humiliation, was common and socially accepted. Chamber girls could be blamed for accidents, household tensions, or even their mistress's displeasure, regardless of fault.
Physical punishment was not uncommon, especially in households where servants were viewed as expendable. Slaps, beatings, or forced labor as punishment reinforced obedience through pain and intimidation. Emotional abuse was equally damaging, as constant criticism and lack of appreciation eroded self-worth. Chamber girls were also vulnerable to exploitation, particularly young girls serving far from home without family protection. Their dependence on the household for food and shelter made resistance difficult and dangerous. Speaking out risked dismissal or worse. Abuse often went unreported, as servants lacked credibility and social support. Even kind treatment could shift suddenly, leaving chamber girls in a state of constant uncertainty. The threat of mistreatment shaped behavior, encouraging silence, submission, and compliance. Medieval society largely ignored servant abuse, viewing it as a private matter within the household. This acceptance allowed harmful behavior to continue unchecked. For chamber girls, survival depended not only on hard work, but also on navigating power dynamics carefully. Harsh treatment was not an exception, but a possibility woven into the fabric of service, reinforcing inequality and fear. The lack of legal protection left chamber girls extremely vulnerable within medieval society. Laws were designed primarily to protect landowners, nobles, and institutions, not servants or laborers. Chamber girls had no formal contracts, labor rights, or guaranteed wages. Employment depended entirely on the goodwill of the household, and dismissal could occur without warning or explanation. If a chamber girl was mistreated, injured, or unfairly punished, she had little recourse. Her word held little weight in legal or social disputes, especially against members of the nobility. Reporting abuse was risky and often futile, as authorities typically sided with employers. This imbalance of power meant that justice was rarely accessible to servants. Without legal safeguards, chamber girls lived in constant insecurity, knowing that illness, injury, or displeasure could cost them their livelihood. Even theft accusations, whether true or false, could ruin a girl's reputation permanently. A damaged reputation made future employment nearly impossible, pushing some into extreme poverty. The absence of protection reinforced obedience, as survival depended on staying in favor. Medieval society accepted this inequality as natural, believing that social order required strict hierarchy. Chamber girls were expected to endure hardship quietly, without complaint. This lack of protection ensured that their labor remained cheap and controllable, while their suffering remained invisible. It highlights how medieval systems prioritized privilege over humanity, leaving chamber girls exposed to exploitation with no safety net. Although life as a chamber girl was demanding and restrictive, the position occasionally offered access to better food or clothing than what many peasant girls experienced at home. In noble households, food supplies were generally more stable and varied than in rural villages, where meals depended heavily on harvest success. A chamber girl's daily diet, while still simple, often included regular portions of bread, porridge, vegetables, and broth, with occasional access to meat or leftovers from the noble table during feast days. This consistency alone represented a significant improvement for girls from food-insecure households. Clothing provided by the household was also more durable and better made than peasant garments, as it needed to withstand frequent use. While plain in appearance, these clothes offered warmth and protection, particularly in winter. Hand-me-down garments or worn items from the household might also be passed down to servants, providing access to materials that would otherwise be unaffordable. However, these benefits were conditional and dependent on good behavior and continued service. Better provisions were not rights but privileges that could be withdrawn as punishment.
Despite this, access to reliable food and clothing provided a degree of physical security that many chamber girls had never known before. These modest improvements did not erase hardship, but they represented one of the few tangible advantages of domestic service. In a society marked by scarcity, even small comforts carried great significance, shaping how chamber girls perceived their position, despite its many hardships.
One of the less visible benefits of serving as a chamber girl was the opportunity to learn manners, practical skills, and, in rare cases, basic literacy. Through daily observation, chamber girls absorbed the customs and behaviors expected in noble society, such as proper speech, posture, and conduct. These manners could later prove useful, especially if the girls sought service in another household or hoped to marry someone employed in a skilled trade. Chamber girls also developed a wide range of practical skills, including sewing, mending, organizing, cleaning, and personal care. These abilities were valuable and transferable, increasing their usefulness and employability. Occasionally, chamber girls were exposed to reading or writing, particularly if they assisted educated mistresses or worked in households where books and letters were common. While formal instruction was rare, some girls learned to recognize letters or words simply by being present during lessons or correspondence. Such knowledge was uncommon among peasant women and could set a chamber girl apart. These learning opportunities were not guaranteed and depended heavily on the household and the disposition of the mistress. Still, for some girls, service provided an informal education unavailable elsewhere. These acquired skills represented a quiet form of advancement, offering a sense of personal growth within a restrictive system. Though limited, this learning allowed chamber girls to gain knowledge that could slightly improve their future prospects. In addition to food, clothing, and wages, chamber girls sometimes received small gifts or tips as rewards for good service. These tokens were often given on special occasions, such as holidays, weddings, or successful events hosted by the household. Gifts might include coins, extra food, pieces of clothing, or small personal items like ribbons or trinkets. Though modest in value, these gifts held great importance for chamber girls, who owned very little and had few opportunities to acquire personal belongings. Tips could also come from guests, especially if the chamber girl provided exceptional assistance or demonstrated good manners. Such rewards served as incentives for loyalty and hard work, reinforcing the expectation of obedience. However, gifts were unpredictable and entirely dependent on the generosity of others. They were not guaranteed and could not be requested without appearing ungrateful or disrespectful. Despite their uncertainty, these gifts allowed chamber girls to save small amounts of money or acquire items for future use. Some saved coins for marriage or emergencies, while others sent gifts home to their families. These occasional rewards offered brief moments of recognition and appreciation in a life often defined by invisibility. Though small, gifts and tips symbolized rare acknowledgement of a chamber girl's labor, providing both practical support and emotional encouragement within an otherwise demanding existence. For a chamber girl in medieval times, marriage was less a romantic ideal and more a fragile hope shaped by class, economics, and survival. Unlike noble women whose marriages were strategic alliances, a chamber girl's prospects depended almost entirely on circumstance, reputation, and timing. Love was a luxury, stability was the goal. Most chamber girls came from peasant families and entered service at a young age, often between the ages of 12 and 16. Once in service, their lives were tightly controlled. Long hours, constant supervision, and strict moral expectations left little opportunity to meet potential husbands.
Contact with men was limited to other servants, stable boys, grooms, guards or craftsmen, or to villagers during rare moments outside the castle walls. Reputation was everything. A chamber girl was expected to be modest, obedient, and chaste. Even rumors of impropriety could ruin her chances of marriage permanently. If a girl became pregnant out of wedlock, she faced severe consequences: dismissal, public shame, or being cast into poverty. In some cases, she might be forced into prostitution or beggary. Thus, many chamber girls lived with constant fear, knowing how thin the line was between respectability and ruin.
Marriage, when it did happen, usually occurred later than for village girls. Service delayed marriage because employers often preferred unmarried female servants, believing them to be more obedient and less distracted. Some contracts even forbade marriage while in service. A chamber girl might serve well into her 20s before being released, at which point suitable husbands were fewer. However, service also offered opportunities unavailable to poorer peasants. A chamber girl could meet men with steady employment, skilled artisans, clerks, or household officials. These men, while not wealthy, represented stability. A marriage to a steward's assistant or a yeoman could raise her social standing slightly, offering a modest home and regular meals. Occasionally, a benevolent mistress might help arrange a marriage, offering a small dowry, such as clothing, household goods, or coins. This was rare, but transformative. Without a dowry, many men were unwilling to marry, as marriage meant economic responsibility. Marriage was not always an escape from hardship. Married women continued to work, often taking in laundry, spinning wool, or assisting their husbands' trades. Yet marriage provided something service could not: a sense of belonging, protection, and social legitimacy. For many chamber girls, marriage remained an uncertain dream, one that hovered on the horizon but was never guaranteed. Some never married at all, aging out of service and slipping quietly into poverty. Their lives remind us that for women of the lower classes, marriage was not a fairy tale ending, but a precarious negotiation with fate. Advancement within a medieval household was possible, but rare, slow, and fiercely competitive. For a chamber girl, rising to a higher servant role represented one of the few paths to improved status, security, and dignity. Yet success depended on loyalty, endurance, and the unpredictable favor of one's superiors. The servant hierarchy was rigid. At the bottom were scullery maids and general laborers. Chamber girls occupied a slightly higher rung, as they worked in private spaces and attended directly to noblewomen. Above them were ladies-in-waiting, housekeepers, and senior attendants, positions that carried authority, better food, and sometimes private rooms. Advancement was not based on talent alone. Years of faithful service were required, often a decade or more. A chamber girl had to prove absolute discretion. She heard secrets about affairs, finances, and politics, and survival depended on silence. A single betrayal could end her career, or worse. Skill mattered. A capable chamber girl learned fine tasks: dressing noblewomen, caring for expensive fabrics, managing cosmetics, and maintaining order in private chambers. Literacy, though rare, was invaluable. A girl who could read prayers, keep simple accounts, or follow written instructions had an advantage over others. Trust was the true currency of advancement. If a mistress relied on a chamber girl, confiding in her, entrusting her with keys, or allowing her to oversee junior servants, that trust could lead to promotion. Becoming a lady's personal attendant elevated a servant's status dramatically, placing her closer to power and comfort. However, advancement also brought danger. Higher-ranking servants were more visible and more vulnerable to blame. If something went wrong, a theft, scandal, or political misstep, senior servants were often scapegoated. With authority came responsibility and risk. Some chamber girls advanced to the role of housekeeper, managing linens, schedules, and staff. This position granted influence and relative independence, especially for older women who had outlived marriage prospects. These women commanded respect within the household, even from men. Yet most chamber girls never advanced. Favoritism, class prejudice, and sheer luck played enormous roles. A girl could serve faithfully her entire life without recognition. Advancement was not a promise, but a gamble. In a world with few exits from poverty, climbing the servant hierarchy was one of the only ladders available. Each step upward came at the cost of years of labor, submission, and sacrifice, making every promotion hard-won and deeply meaningful. The idea of saving money as a chamber girl in medieval times was fraught with difficulty. While some chamber girls were paid wages, these sums were small, irregular, and often supplemented or replaced by room and board. Saving required discipline, luck, and restraint in a world where survival consumed nearly everything. Many chamber girls received annual wages rather than weekly pay. This lump sum might be paid at the end of service, making servants vulnerable to dismissal without compensation. Typical wages were modest, barely enough to cover basic clothing, shoes, and occasional personal items. For some, wages were withheld entirely, justified by the cost of food and lodging. Despite this, even small earnings held immense value. A few coins could mean independence, the ability to buy cloth, tools, or contribute to a dowry. Saving was often done secretly. Servants hid coins in hems, wooden chests, or wrapped in cloth beneath floorboards. Theft was common, and trust was scarce. Expenses quickly eroded savings. Clothing wore out fast due to constant labor. Shoes were expensive and essential. Medical care, when needed, drained resources. Church offerings, though small, were socially expected. A chamber girl had little left after these obligations. Yet saving was an act of hope. Money represented choice, however limited. With savings, a chamber girl could leave service, marry with dignity, or survive periods of unemployment. Some aimed to save enough to open a small stall, assist a husband's trade, or enter a convent. Mistresses sometimes rewarded loyal service with gifts rather than wages, clothing, jewelry, or household goods. These gifts meant more than coins, as they signaled favor and social endorsement. However, saving also carried risk. If discovered hoarding money, a servant could be accused of theft. Power imbalance meant accusations often favored the employer. Many girls spent their wages quickly, knowing money offered little protection against sudden dismissal or illness. For most chamber girls, savings never amounted to security. Still, the act of saving, however small, was a quiet rebellion against a life of dependence. Each hidden coin was a statement of self-worth, a belief that the future might hold more than endless service. In this way, saving wages was not merely economic behavior, but an emotional and psychological lifeline in a world that offered very few. A chamber girl's day in medieval times began long before sunrise. The castle was still dark, the stone floors cold beneath bare or thinly shod feet when she rose from her pallet in the servants' quarters. There was no lingering in sleep. Bells, habit, or the sharp voice of a senior servant marked the start of her labor. Each day followed a rhythm as fixed as the seasons. Her first task was to fetch water, heavy buckets drawn from a well or cistern. This water would be used for washing, drinking, and cleaning the private chambers of her lady. The weight strained her arms, but there was no choice. Fires had to be lit next, often with numb fingers, coaxing embers back to life so the noble household would wake to warmth. Once the household stirred, the chamber girl's work moved upstairs. She entered the private chambers quietly, expected to be nearly invisible. Beds were stripped and remade with fresh linens. Night pots were emptied discreetly. Floors were swept, rushes replaced, and tapestries brushed free of dust. Every movement required care. One mistake could bring punishment. When her mistress awoke, the chamber girl assisted with dressing. She laid out garments in order, tightened laces, arranged veils, and combed hair. These moments required patience and skill. Pins could prick, silk could tear. A wrong fold might bring sharp words. Yet here, closer than anywhere else, the chamber girl witnessed noble life at its most human. Sleepy eyes, private worries, whispered prayers. Midday brought no rest. Meals for servants were eaten quickly, often standing. Bread, pottage, ale, fuel, not pleasure. Then came more cleaning, mending linens, laundering garments in cold water, scrubbing stains by hand. She ran errands through corridors and courtyards, carried messages, fetched herbs, and answered bells. Afternoons were unpredictable. A feast, a visitor, a sudden command, all meant extra work. The chamber girl had to be ready at any moment. Time was never her own. As evening fell, she prepared her mistress for supper or bed, removing layers of clothing, setting aside jewelry, and ensuring comfort. Candles were lit, fires tended once more.
Behind the steady hands and lowered eyes of a chamber girl lived a world of emotion rarely acknowledged. Her outer obedience concealed a constant inner tension, a careful balance between endurance and despair. Fear was ever present, fear of making mistakes, fear of punishment, fear of dismissal, which meant instant poverty. A broken cup, a misplaced key, a careless word, any could undo years of service. This fear shaped her behavior, teaching silence, caution, and restraint. She learned to make herself small. Yet there was pride, too, quiet pride in doing her work well, in being trusted with private spaces, in knowing the rhythms of the household. When her mistress relied on her, even briefly, it felt like recognition, proof that she mattered, if only a little. Loneliness weighed heavily. Surrounded by people, she still stood apart. Friendships among servants were fragile, strained by competition and gossip. Trust was dangerous. Dreams were whispered only in the dark, if at all. Her thoughts often wandered beyond the stone walls. She imagined a different life, a home of her own, freedom from orders, mornings without bells. Sometimes she dreamed of love, though she knew how easily such dreams could destroy her. Desire was a risk she could not afford. There was anger buried deep, anger at unfair treatment, at being invisible, at watching waste and excess while servants went hungry. But anger had no safe outlet. It hardened into resignation. Faith offered some comfort. Prayer was a refuge, a place where she could speak freely, even if only to God. She asked not for wealth, but for mercy, health, and survival. Exhaustion dulled her emotions over time. Days blurred together. The years passed quietly. She aged faster than noble women, her body marked by labor. Still, she endured. What sustained her was hope, small, stubborn hope. Hope for kindness, for change, for something better, even if it never came. In a world that rarely remembered women like her greatest struggle was to believe her life had meaning. And perhaps it did, not in chronicles or songs, but in the countless unseen moments that kept the medieval world turning. As the years pass,
The chamber girl begins to look back on her life, not in grand milestones, but in countless ordinary moments. The mornings she rose before the sun, the fires she lit, the beds she made and remade for others, while her own remained narrow and cold. Her life, she realizes, was not marked by celebration, but by endurance. She remembers the girl she once was, young, uncertain, brought into service with promises of food, shelter, and opportunity. She had believed time would open doors. Instead, time closed them quietly. Youth faded, strength waned, dreams grew smaller, shaped by reality rather than hope. Yet regret is not the only thing she feels. There is pride in her survival. She lived through illness, hunger, and fear. She learned skills that kept her fed when many did not. She navigated a world that offered her little protection and no forgiveness. Every day she remained standing was an achievement. She reflects on the people who passed through her life. Some were kind, others cruel, most indifferent. She remembers a gentle word from a mistress on a hard day, or a shared laugh with another servant late at night. These moments, fleeting as they were, carried her through years of labor. She wonders what mark she has left. Her name will not appear in records or histories. No song will tell of her service. And yet she knows the household did not function without her. The comfort of others rested on her work. The silence of the chambers, the cleanliness, the order, these were her legacy. As she ages, the future becomes uncertain again. Will she remain in service until her body fails? Will she be dismissed when she can no longer keep pace? These questions linger, unanswered. And still there is acceptance, not surrender, but understanding. Her life was shaped by forces larger than herself: birth, class, gender. Within those confines, she did what she could. She endured. She mattered, even if the world never said so aloud. Her reflection is quiet, uncelebrated, but deeply human. Medieval noble households depended on chamber girls far more than history often acknowledges. These women were the invisible framework that upheld daily life within castles and manors. Without them, comfort, order, and privacy would have collapsed. Chamber girls worked in the most intimate spaces of the household. They cared for private chambers, clothing, linens, and personal belongings. They maintained cleanliness in an age without modern sanitation. They managed tasks that directly affected health, disposing of waste, airing rooms, laundering garments. Their labor prevented disease and decay. They were also guardians of privacy. Chamber girls witnessed moments no one else saw: illness, vulnerability, grief, fear. They heard whispered conversations and saw the unguarded faces of nobility. Their silence was essential. Discretion was not optional. It was survival. Beyond physical labor, chamber girls contributed emotional labor. They soothed, listened, and reassured. They offered companionship in a rigidly hierarchical world where noble women were often isolated. Their presence was steady, constant, and reliable. In times of crisis, illness, childbirth, political upheaval, chamber girls were indispensable. They worked longer hours, took on additional tasks, and adapted without complaint. Their flexibility allowed noble households to function smoothly despite uncertainty. Despite their importance, chamber girls remained undervalued. Their work was considered women's work, expected and unnoticed. Yet the luxury, stability, and reputation of a household rested on their shoulders. They were not passive figures. Through their labor, they sustained the social order of medieval life.
The grandeur of castles was built not only on stone and wealth, but on the hands of women whose names were never recorded. Recognizing their importance reshapes our understanding of medieval society, not as a world driven only by kings and knights, but by countless working women whose labor made that world possible.
Though centuries have passed, the life of a medieval chamber girl echoes strongly in modern domestic work. The tools have changed, the laws have improved, but the underlying dynamics of invisibility, dependence, and undervaluation remain strikingly familiar. Modern domestic workers, maids, cleaners, caregivers, still labor in private spaces. Like chamber girls, they are often unseen, their work noticed only when undone. Clean homes, cared for children, and orderly households are expected outcomes, not achievements. Power imbalance persists. Domestic workers today may still face long hours, low wages, job insecurity, and emotional labor without recognition. Many work without contracts, protections, or clear boundaries, echoing the vulnerability of medieval service. Gender remains central. Domestic labor continues to fall largely on women, often from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or migrant communities. Like chamber girls, modern workers may leave their own families to care for others. However, there are differences. Legal protections, labor rights, and social awareness offer safeguards medieval women never had. Education and mobility provide more avenues for escape. Yet progress is uneven, and exploitation persists. The emotional experience is especially similar. Modern domestic workers often describe loneliness, exhaustion, and pride in their work, feelings that mirror those of medieval chamber girls. The tension between dignity and invisibility remains unresolved. By comparing past and present, we see that the chamber girl's story is not distant history. It is part of an ongoing narrative about labor, class, and gender. Her life challenges us to ask whose work we value and whose we overlook. Remembering chamber girls is not only about honoring the past, it is about recognizing the people who still quietly sustain our lives today.